You're gonna see, I'm gonna bulldoze through this, and then like maybe 5 of these before you're.
We're waiting on one judge, so he said wait till he gets here.
Oh, yeah, no problem. No problem. You can all be seated. It sounds like we're waiting on one more judge, and then we'll get going.
Could I deputize an advocate for a piece of paper and a pen?
Could I also get one?
1 moment.
Thank you so much.
2 pens, 2 papers?
Thank you.
Sure,
Okay.
thank you.
You got it.
That's a point for you already.
Oh,
I
yeah.
was gonna say, I'll fight him over kind of.
Should be 2 points, right?
Thank you.
Of course.
I've got one.
You got a pen, okay, so just 1 pen. I'll give you the whole pad then. There you go.
Oh, look at you.
Let me get you some more of those, please.
The trial's now a formality.
Yeah. Oh, here we go, we have them all right here. And these are from Target. This is what we're
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
Thanks, sorry about that.
Do you have any gum? Gum, yes, I actually do. We have gum, chapstick, pens, anything.
Snacks?
Okay. All right, sorry about the delay. I just wanted to make sure I have my ballot ready. Okay. Is everybody present and ready to proceed from the government side?
Yes, Your Honor.
Is everybody present and ready to proceed from the defense side?
Yes, Your Honor, defense is here and ready to
Okay.
go.
We'll start with appearances from the government.
Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Marra Edwards, and I'm joined today with my counsel, Lillian Meyer,
Good morning, Your Honor.
Morning.
and we represent the government today.
Defense?
Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Thomas Azari. I'm joined here with my co-counsel, Ms. Lauren Wittring.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Morning.
Together, we represent the defendant in today's case, Augie Shepard.
Okay. Sounds great. Thank you. Do we have any preliminary matters from the government?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, we'd like to make a motion for Rule 615 and 603. That's the constructive sequestration and swearing in of all witnesses at this time.
Any objections to invoking those rules?
We don't have an objection to either of them. Just a
Okay.
note for 615 for the court. We have a party representative today, but he's constructively present.
Understood.
Furthermore, Your Honor, I'd like to direct your attention to the pretrial order. It's on page 3 of that binder that you have with you. Stipulation 8 says that exhibits 3 through 6 are waived on all objections. That is the affidavit of Bellamy Dembski, the forensic report by the FBI, and an expert report on organized crime, and we'd move for their admission at this point.
This is pretrial order stipulation 8.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Do you agree with that interpretation of the stipulation?
We absolutely do.
Do you have any objection to those exhibits being admitted now?
Pursuant to that stipulation, we do not.
Okay. Okay, exhibits 3 through 6 are admitted.
With that, Your Honor, we're ready to proceed to openings.
Okay. Any preliminary matters from the defense?
Just a couple things, Your Honor. Since it's our first time in your courtroom, we'd like to ask your preferences regarding movement about the well. Should we ask permission before approaching opposing counsel, the witness, or the jury, or the bench?
Move freely during statements and examinations. Ask for permission to approach both the bench and witnesses.
Understood. The second thing, Your Honor, when an objection is sustained, should we move to strike any offending testimony, or should we just assume that it's stricken?
Move to strike.
Understood. We're ready to proceed.
Okay. Anything else from the government?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, so we're ready to move into opening statements. We'll start with the government. You may proceed whenever you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor. Who wanted Tom Kline dead? On June 24th, 2021, that answer was no one. Because no one knew Tom Kline's secret. Well, he knew. His wife knew. And his witness protection officer knew. on June 25th, that changed. Now, Tom Kline's secret was that his name, his job, in fact, his entire identity was given to him by the government back in 2018. Before that, he was Barry Capello. He was a member of the DeBruno crime organized family, and he lived in Pennsylvania. But back in 2018, Mr. Capello gave testimony against that family. You'll hear that he gave testimony against the defendant. The moment that Mr. Capello stepped on the witness stand, he put a target on his back. Everyone wanted Barry Capello dead, so he had to get away. You'll hear that in exchange for testimony, Barry Capello and his wife were relocated. His new name would be Tom Kline. He would work as a travel agent and live in Los Angeles. And you'll hear that on June 25th, 2021, well, that was a normal day for him. He got up, got dressed, went to work. While he was there, around 1 p.m., he looked up in the window and he froze. Suddenly, the number of people that knew Tom Kline's secret jumped from 3 to 4. And you'll learn that that fourth person, well, that was the defendant, Augie Shepard. 12 hours later, Tom Kline is dead, strangled right in front of his home. Members of the jury, today, you'll hear that the answer to who wanted Tom Kline dead was the defendant. And that's why we're here today. As the government, we have charged the defendant with murder and retaliation against a witness. That means that we have to prove that the defendant killed Tom Kline, that he intended to kill Tom Kline, and that when he killed Tom Kline, it was an act of retaliation for what Tom Kline said about him back in 2018. And as the government, we have the burden of proof in today's case. We have to prove those things to you beyond a reasonable doubt. It's the highest burden in our legal system, and it's one that we embrace wholeheartedly. So let's talk about what we're going to prove and meet that burden. Today you're going to hear from U.S. Deputy Marshal Connor Wright. And Marshal Wright is going to tell you that it's her job to make sure that people like Tom Kline are impossible to find. In fact, you'll hear that up until June 25th, 2021, no one followed Tom Kline. No one threatened Tom Kline. No one so much as recognized Tom Kline as Barry Capello until June 25th. Until the defendant came into town. Who wanted Tom Kline dead? Members of the jury, the evidence will show that the person who wanted Tom Kline dead was the same person who had him testify against him back in 2018, the same person that waited 3 years to exact revenge. Members of the jury, the evidence will show that the person who wanted Tom Kline dead was the defendant. And at the end of today's trial, after you've heard all the evidence, I'll stand right back up here, lay all the evidence out for you. And I'll ask that you find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
All right, thank you, counsel. We'll now hear the opening statement from the defense. Counsel, you may proceed whenever you're ready.
May it please the court. The government didn't catch a killer. They closed a case. Members of the jury, opposing counsel just got up here from the government, Miss Edwards. She told you a story about revenge, about a mob killing. She told you that my client, Augie Shepard, he's a mob boss. And that on June 25th, 2021, while he's in LA, he looks for Barry Capello and kills him. She told you that he left his hotel room, drove down the street to Barry Capello's house in a green Ferrari, killed him by strangling him to death, got back in that Ferrari, and left. It's a compelling story. I'll admit it. It's like something out of an episode of The Sopranos. But here's the problem. It's not true. Here's the truth. June 25th was a normal day for Augie Shepard. And he went on a trip to LA with his daughter, Lauren, to check out some college campuses. They went to UCLA, did a college tour, got lunch right before it, got ice cream, went back to their hotel, did something for a few hours, got dinner, and then went back to sleep after a really long day. That's all that happened on June 25th. The tale of revenge and murder that the government's trying to spin you, it's just not true, because they didn't catch a killer. They just closed the case. So, members of the jury, Ms. Edwards is right when she says she has a burden of proof today. Because the government, when they walked in through those doors, they carried with them the highest burden in our legal system beyond a reasonable doubt. It was their burden to prove that Augie Shepard intentionally killed Barry Capello, and that he did so because Barry Capello testified against him in the past. That's what they have to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt today. You're going to see that they won't be able to because of three important questions. The first, what evidence does the government actually have? The second, could Augie Shepard have even committed this crime in the first place? And third, does their story make any sense? So let's start with that first one. What evidence does the government actually have? Oh, you're going to hear today when their expert witness testifies that they don't have any DNA evidence, they don't have any fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no camera footage, nothing that places Augie Shepard at the scene of the crime when it's being committed. In fact, you're going to learn that there's cell phone records that place Mr. Shepard at his hotel room that entire night. Now that second question, could Mr. Shepard have committed this crime? You're going to hear from that U.S. agent, Connor Wright. Connor Wright, she's good at her job. That's what you're going to hear. When she puts somebody in witness protection, nobody can find him. That she's helped over 100 witnesses in the past. Not a single one of them has ever been killed. Nobody knows where this person lives, so you're going to ask yourself the obvious question, how did he know how to get to his house? And you're going to see that there was no way Mr. Shepard could have figured out where Barry Capello lived so he could drive over there and kill him. That's going to bring us to the third question. Does their story make any sense? Because you're going to hear from Mr. Shepard's daughter today, Lauren Shepard. And she's going to tell you exactly what they did the whole day. That her father was rarely ever out of her sight, that they didn't have a fight, there wasn't any anger coming from her dad. His mood was normal the entire day. That's what you're going to hear. You're going to hear that her dad went to sleep at 10 o'clock, woke up at 5, and that was it. That's all he did that day. That their story doesn't make any sense because they didn't catch a killer. They just closed the case. So members of the jury, I'm going to get a chance to come back and speak to you again at the end of today's trial. We're going to walk through the evidence that the government presented. We're going to ask those three questions one more time to see if they answered them. You'll find that they won't, because they didn't catch a killer. They closed the case. At that point, I'm going to ask that you find Augie Shepard not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Before we call our first witness, I just want to say something explicitly that I think was kind of implied earlier. All witnesses are presumed sworn, and Rule 615 is invoked. I realize I didn't say that explicitly. Thank you, counsel. So the government, you may call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the government calls Marshal Connor Wright to the stand.
Okay. Marshal Wright. You are sworn.
Yes, Your Honor.
And counsel, you may proceed whenever you are ready.
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning. Could you please introduce yourself to the jury?
I'm U.S. Deputy Marshal Connor Wright.
Marshal, could you tell us what you're doing in court today?
I'm here today because Barry Capello was under my protection in the witness protection program, and he was murdered.
Could you tell us a little bit about your job?
So I'm in the witness protection program, like I said. We call it WITSEC. Part of my job is relocating people who've testified against people we find dangerous and putting them somewhere else so they can't be found.
Well, before we talk about how you caught Mr. Capello's killer, I want to talk a little bit more about Barry Capello. Could you tell us who that was?
Absolutely. Mr. Capello used to live in Philadelphia, and he was a part of the De Bruno crime family. It's part of the mafia in Philadelphia. And he testified against Mr. Shepard, and he was put into witness protection. I was in charge of that.
Objection, Your Honor, to lack of foundation. May I be heard?
Yes.
The witness just testified that Augie Shepard was a part of a specific crime family and that witness testified to that effect. There's no foundation on the record as to how this witness knows that, if she was there at the trial, if she read a transcript or anything like that. Before she testifies to specific facts within any transcript or within any testimony, they have to lay foundation that she knows it.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor. Marshall Wright already testified that it's her job to relocate people. She already told us that she relocated Barry Capello, and so it's natural that she would know the nature of why she would need to relocate this person. Furthermore, as to Augie Shepard, of course she would know, based on what Barry Capello testified, whether or not Mr. Shepard was a part of this De Bruno crime family.
May I respond?
Briefly.
Counsel said that of course she would have known, and it's reasonable to assume that she would have known. And that's not how lack of foundation works. Your Honor, we have to have foundation on the record as to how she would know and if she would know. We don't have that, so we can't just assume that she does.
Your Honor, I can lay that foundation.
Okay, well, if you're, okay. So in that case, the objection is sustained.
Move to strike until they lay that foundation.
The testimony is stricken, subject to more foundation being laid.
Marshall Wright, do you know why Barry Capello was put into witness protection?
I do. When I receive a case, I look at all the different documents that came before me. That included some testimony that Mr. Capello had made against Mr. Shepard.
All right, well, could you tell us who Augie Shepard is?
Yes. Mr. Shepard is the head of the De Bruno crime family in Philadelphia. That same one I mentioned earlier that Mr. Capello was a part of.
All right, now I want to go back to witness protection. Could you tell us what that entails?
Absolutely. So basically, we move people as far as we can from the place that they're in danger from. So in Mr. Capello's case, we moved him from Philadelphia to California. We gave him a new name, which was Tom Kline. We gave him a new job. He worked at a travel agency. We gave him a new house. A whole new life, basically.
All right, well, you said that you moved Mr. Capello to L.A. What was Augie Shepard doing in L.A.?
We found evidence that Mr. Shepard was in L.A. taking a college tour with his daughter of UCLA.
All right, and we'll get to that in just a moment, but I want to ask you, how long did you keep Barry Capello in witness protection?
Well, he testified in 2018, and he was killed in 2021.
All right, and in that time frame, did you keep in regular contact with Mr. Capello?
I did. That's part of my job.
And in that time frame, did you ever hear of anyone threatening Mr. Capello?
No,
Did you ever hear of anyone following Mr. Capello?
I did not, no.
Up until June 25th, did you hear of anyone recognizing Barry Capello as Tom Kline?
No.
What changed on June 25th?
Well, we found evidence that on June 25th, Mr. Shepard came to town, and he was in the area where Mr. Kline, used to be Mr. Capello, worked.
All right, well, I want to talk about that. Now, you mentioned that the defendant was in LA for a college tour. Could you tell us a little bit about what he was doing that day?
Absolutely. So we learned from receipts that he came into town around 10 a.m. and checked into his hotel. Then he and his daughter went to a restaurant called Pomodoro. They went then, after that restaurant, to an ice cream shop. Now, in between those two shops was Kline Travel, and that's where we had placed Mr. Kline to work.
All right, well, I want to break that up a bit. What time was the defendant done eating lunch at the Pomodoro?
His receipts show that he was done at 12:50.
All right, and what time did he go to get ice cream at Saffron and Rose?
Well, that receipt was printed at 12:52.
Do you know how he got from the Pomodoro to Saffron and Rose?
As far as I know, he walked.
All right, and how far are Pomodoro and Saffron and Rose?
A building away. There's only one in between them, and that was Kline Travel.
Well, to your knowledge, did the defendant or Mr. Kline ever see each other?
Yes. I received a call that nobody in my line of work ever wants to get. Mr. Capello called me and told me that he had seen Augie Shepard right outside of his place of work.
Objection, Your Honor, to hearsay.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor. I'm actually laying foundation to enter into evidence Exhibit 14, which is a voicemail, the one that Marshal Wright is talking about. I believe that this is a present sense impression under Rule 803.1, something that describes an event or condition while or immediately after it's happening. And if I have a little bit more leeway to lay that foundation to enter in this document, we'll be able to show that at the time that the call was placed was at 12:50. Marshal Wright has already testified that the defendant was done eating lunch at 12:57, that he walked past Kline Travel Agency, and that's only a 3-minute window for the defendant to walk past and for Mr. Capello to call. That certainly falls within that 803.1 exception.
Response?
Your Honor, specifically to 803.1. The present sense impression, it can be made, it says that it has to be made immediately while or immediately after the declarant is perceiving an act or condition. If I could direct your attention to the specific transcript of that voicemail that we're referencing, it might be a little easier. That's Exhibit 14 in that binder.
All right, I'm here.
If you wouldn't mind giving me a sec to get there,
Of course.
Okay. Your Honor, Exhibit 14, that's a transcript of Exhibit 13, which is the actual audio clip.
Okay.
Now, Exhibit 14 says, call me when you get this. I think they found me. Augie Shepard just walked by my office window, and we made eye contact. Now, this voicemail, we have a good faith basis to believe was made after the witness had called his wife and told her about this, and then he called the marshal in order to tell him the specific contents of this voicemail. Present sense impression requires immediately after or during. We know that there was a moment of contemplation when he called his wife. It doesn't qualify.
And I'm guessing we don't have any authority that gives any guidelines on how long is too long to qualify for this particular exception, right?
We don't have specific case law or anything, or judicial notes or anything like that.
Okay.
But Your Honor, we have that basis to believe that he made a phone call to his wife, spoke about this conversation, spoke about whether or not he did or didn't see Mr. Shepard at that point, and then he called the deputy marshal.
May I be heard on-
Understood. Last response, briefly.
Yes, Your Honor. As I said, pretrial order says that call was made at 12:50. Marshal Wright has already testified that the defendant was done with lunch at 12:47. That's a 3-minute window for this call, for the defendant to have walked past Kline Travel and for Mr. Capello to have made this call. In the exhibit that Mr. Azari mentioned or referenced, it says Augie Shepard just walked past my office. Present sense impression doesn't say that it has to be like a second after. There's no evidence to show that this wasn't a present sense impression, that it wasn't made while or immediately after.
Your Honor, can I
Okay.
direct your attention to that evidence? Because we do have it.
No, I'm ready to rule. I'm going to overrule the objection. The factors you just laid out, if you choose to do so, you can cover them on cross-examination or through another witness. Objection overruled.
Yes, Your Honor. Marshal Wright, you were talking about a call that you had received. Could you tell us a little bit more about it?
Of course. It was from Mr. Capello. He called my office phone and left a voicemail, which I didn't hear until the next day, telling me that he had seen Augie Shepard right outside his place of work and that the two of them had made eye contact.
All right, well, I want to talk a little bit about that voicemail. If you could turn in your binder to page, exhibit number 14.
Absolutely. You'll have to give me just a second, Counselor. All right, here I am.
All right, could you tell the jury what you're looking at?
This is a transcript of the voicemail that was left for me on my office phone by Barry Capello.
Is it an accurate representation of what Mr. Capello said?
Yes.
At this time, the government moves for the admission of Exhibit 14.
Pursuant to your previous ruling, Your Honor, we don't have an objection.
Exhibit 14 is admitted.
Yes, Your Honor. Marshal Wright, could you read the contents of that voicemail to the jury?
I can. Call me when you get this. I think they found me. Augie Shepard just walked by my office window, and we made eye contact. And that's it.
What time did you receive this voicemail?
12:50.
How many hours passed between when you received that voicemail and when Mr. Kline was killed?
12 hours.
Agent Marshall, do you know how Mr. Kline was killed?
Yes. The forensic evidence shows he was strangled.
Do you know what he was strangled with?
Yes. We found evidence that he was strangled with a pair of jumper cables.
Did you ever find these cables?
We did, yes.
Would you recognize them if I were to show them to you?
I would.
Your Honor, permission to approach Marshal Wright with the jumper cables?
You may.
Thank you, counsel.
Marshal Wright, could you tell the jury what I've just handed you?
These are the jumper cables we found near Mr. Kline's body.
And have they changed in any way since you found them?
No, they have not.
And to your knowledge, has a chain of custody been kept for those?
I did it myself, yes.
Your Honor, at this time, we move for the admission of the jumper cables.
Any objection?
There's no objection.
Okay. The exhibit is admitted. What's the exhibit?
Number 26.
Okay, exhibit 26 is admitted.
Agent Marshall, could you tell us if the defendant had access to any jumper cables?
We found evidence that he did, yes. We found evidence that Mr. Shepard rented a car from a rental agency which had jumper cables in the trunk.
Objection, Your Honor, to under Rule 403 and lack of foundation. May I be heard?
Yes, explain 403 and the lack of foundation objections in turn.
Of course. Your Honor, there's a substantial danger of unfairly misleading the jury with a testimony that was just elicited by that witness. Ms. Edwards' question was, did you have any evidence that he had access to jumper cables? We actually know, and the witness did say that yes, we found that he did because that rental car had jumper cables in it. We actually have a piece of evidence. If you could turn to Exhibit 10 in your binder. That's actually a letter from the car rental company. And that car rental company says that between the time of January of 2021 to July of 2021, 18 different people had access to that car and to those cables. They actually don't know, it says in there, they don't know whether or not those cables were present when the car was rented out or when it was brought back.
Okay, I think I understand the argument. What's your lack of foundation argument?
The lack of foundation argument, Your Honor, comes in when the witness says specifically that my client had access to those jumper cables, because the witness hasn't stated how she knows whether or not those jumper cables were in the car when he rented it.
All right, fair enough. Response?
Yes, Your Honor. First to the 403. 403 requires that evidence has to be substantially more prejudicial than it is probative. Certainly it's probative whether or not the defendant had access to the murder weapon. The points that Mr. Azari are addressing can be better addressed on cross. We'd be happy to move for the admission of this exhibit, as it does show that the car rental that the defendant got his car from did provide nightlight cables. Furthermore, to that lack of foundation objection, my next question to Ms. Marshall was going to be how she knew this. And again, we can offer for the admission of Exhibit 10.
May I respond?
I think I'm ready to rule. Objection overruled. You can cover that on cross if you choose to. I think that goes to weight.
Yes, Your Honor. So, Marshal Wright, did you know if the defendant had access to any jumper cables?
Yes. We looked into the records of Mr. Shepard's trip to LA and we found that he had rented a car. So we contacted that rental agency and asked if they had jumper cables in those cars.
Well, how did they respond to that?
They said that all the cars that they have nightlight jumper cables in the trunk.
What kind of jumper cables are those?
These are nightlight jumper cables.
And when you talked to the rental agency, did they say that there were any jumper cables missing from the car that the defendant rented?
They actually did, yes. That car did not have any jumper cables in the trunk.
Agent Marshall, did you find any forensic evidence connecting the defendant to Mr. Tom Kline's home?
Yes. We found footprints and we found evidence of a dark sports car outside his house around the time of the murder.
And before we get to that, do you know where the defendant was staying that night? Or where the defendant stayed during his trip to UCLA?
Yes, he was staying at the UCLA guest house. I believe it's very close to campus.
All right, and do you know how far that UCLA guest house was from the defendant? Or from Mr. Kline?
I believe that would be about 20 minutes.
All right, well, first I want to talk about, you mentioned that you did have forensic evidence connecting the defendant to the crime. So I want to talk to you about the footprints. What size footprint did the defendant have?
The defendant wore a size 11 shoe.
Your Honor, at this time, my co-counsel will be reading onto the record a portion of what's been pre-admitted as Exhibit Number 4. That's a forensic report.
Any objection to reading from this exhibit?
There's no objection.
Okay, you may do so.
Line 43. 4 footprints found in grass on the side of the house, 19 feet from body. Measured as men's shoes, approximately size 11.
Marshal Wright, you also noted that the defendant, what else connected the defendant to the crime scene was a rental car. Do you know what sort of car the defendant rented?
Yes, we were made aware that he rented a dark green Ferrari sports car.
Your Honor, at this time, my co-counsel will be reading onto the record a section of what's been pre-admitted as Exhibit 3. That's an eyewitness account from Mr. Kline's neighbor across the street.
Any objection to the reading from the exhibit?
There's no objection.
Okay, you may do so, counsel.
Line 20. In the early morning of June 26th, around 12:30 a.m., Cupboard started barking. I got out of bed and went to the front window. I saw an expensive sports car parked across the street. Line 24. It was definitely a dark color. I hadn't seen it there earlier that night, and it didn't belong to any of my neighbors.
Agent Marshall, were you able to close this case?
Yes.
And who did you find to be the killer of Tom Kline?
All the evidence that we found pointed to Mr. Shepard.
Thank you. Nothing further, Your Honor.
All right, thank you, counsel. And defense, you may proceed with cross-examination whenever you're ready.
Good morning.
Good morning, counselor.
How you doing?
Doing pretty well.
That's good to hear. Ma'am, I want to start off by talking about those jumper cables that you have right in front of you and talking about what evidence you actually have in this case.
All
Okay?
right.
Those jumper cables, that's what you claim to be the murder weapon, right?
Yes, the forensic evidence shows that these actually match the strangulation marks on Mr. Capello's neck.
I want to talk more about the specific forensic evidence you found on those jumper cables.
Absolutely.
Well, you'd agree with me. You didn't find Mr. Shepard's DNA on those cables, right?
No, the only DNA that we found on the cables was Mr. Capello's.
So no DNA from Mr. Shepard on those cables.
No, like I said, just one person's, and that was Mr. Capello's.
You didn't find his fingerprints on those cables, right?
No, we did not.
So now I want to talk a little bit more about the how you know he got there, okay? So
Sure.
you mentioned on direct examination that you found evidence he was staying at the UCLA guest house, right?
That's right. We received a receipt from his check-in.
You didn't see any camera footage that saw him leaving his hotel room that night? Did
No,
you?
there were no cameras, actually. We checked. No cameras.
No witnesses that said he left his hotel room that night?
That's right.
Nobody that saw him come back to his hotel room that night?
No, counselor.
I want to talk a little bit more about that Ferrari that you mentioned. You'd recognize the photo of it if we looked at it today, right?
That is not the kind of car you forget.
Exactly, ma'am. This, what I'm holding up right now, Exhibit 19, that's the car, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
Fair and accurate copy?
Yes.
We offer Exhibit 19.
Any objection to the admission of 19?
No objection, Your Honor.
Okay,
May-
19 is admitted.
May I approach and tender?
You may.
Ma'am, that Ferrari, that's the one that Mr. Shepard was driving while he was in LA, right?
Yes, I just want a little bit of an up-close look. That's correct.
That's the vehicle that you said was the one that he drove to kill Barry Capello, right?
That's correct.
And now I want to talk a little bit more about if he could have actually committed this crime, okay?
All right.
Now, you're in witness protection, aren't you?
Well, I facilitate witness protection.
You facilitated over 100 different people getting put in witness protection, right?
That's correct.
You gave all those people new lives, new houses, and new jobs, right?
That's right.
You did the same thing for Barry Capello, right?
That's right.
New house, new name, new job.
All of that, yes.
I want to focus on his house. Oh, because his house, it's not publicly listed as belonging to Barry Capello, is it?
No, we don't put it even under his new name, Tom Kline. The house isn't listed under either of those to make him harder to find.
You're good at your job, aren't you?
I like to think so, counselor.
Because you're good at your job, you make it your priority to make sure nobody can figure out where a witness lives, right?
Of course, that's always the goal.
No evidence putting Tom Kline or Barry Capello as living in the house that he actually was living in, right?
We try to limit that as much as possible, yes.
In fact, there's no information that puts Tom Kline or Barry Capello as living in that house, right?
No publicly listed information, no.
So now I want to talk about how you closed this case, because, Agent, it's true that you spoke to somebody named Bellamy Dembski, right?
That's correct. We kind of mentioned that earlier. He's the neighbor who witnessed the killing.
When you spoke to the neighbor who witnessed the killing, you asked him some questions about who the person might have been, right?
That's correct.
You showed him a photo of 4 different people, right?
We gave him a photo lineup, including Mr. Kline, who he could identify, but that was the only person he identified from the lineup.
I want to break down that photo lineup that you showed this witness. You showed this witness a photo of Barry Capello, right?
That's correct.
He said, oh yeah, that's Tom Kline. That's my neighbor, right?
Yes.
Now, Tom Kline, Barry Capello, same person, right?
Yes.
In that photo, right next to Barry Capello, was Audrey Shepard, right?
That's correct.
You asked the witness, do you recognize anybody else in this photo? Didn't you?
That's right.
When you asked this witness if he recognized anybody else in this photo, he said, no, I don't recognize anybody else. Didn't he?
That's exactly right, Counselor. Yes.
Thank you. Your Honor, I have nothing further.
Thank you, counsel. Any redirect examination?
No redirect, Your Honor. I just ask the marshal be allowed to step down.
Thank you for your time, Marshal. You may step down.
Thank you.
And with that, Your Honor, the government rests our case in chief.
Okay. All right. So I think the instruction is to just move forward with the defense case. So defense, you may call your witness whenever you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor. Before we do, we'd like to read a portion of Exhibit 4, pre-admitted, onto the record.
Okay. Any objection to that?
No objection, Your Honor.
Okay, you may do so.
Specifically, we're looking at cellular evidence on the second page, line 8. Obtained warrant for Audrey Shepard's iPhone 12, the phone, and all data associated with the phone. Location data places the phone at UCLA Guest House from 5:45 p.m. from 10:15 p.m. excuse me, on June 25th to 5 a.m. on June 26th. With that, Your Honor, we're ready to call our first witness.
Okay, you may do so.
We call Lauren Shepard.
All right, Ms. Shepard, you're sworn. And counsel, you may proceed whenever you're ready.
Good morning.
Good morning.
You doing all right, Lauren?
I could be better.
Well, I'll try to get you out of here pretty quick so you can feel a little better. Lauren, could you introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Sure. My name is Lauren Shepard. I just graduated from high school.
You said you just graduated high school. Are you looking at colleges?
Yeah, biology programs, actually.
Do you know why you're here today?
Yeah. My dad has been accused of killing my uncle, Barry Capello.
Your uncle, Barry Capello. Who's that?
Well, he was sort of a friend of the family of my dad since I was growing up, so I knew him since I was a kid.
You said that you knew him since you were a kid. Is your dad and Barry Capello, are they still friends?
No, they're not.
Why not?
Well, a couple years ago, in 2018, I saw all over the news. My dad talked to me about it. Uncle Barry testified in a trial against my cousin. It was a whole mess, and we haven't really seen Uncle Barry since.
Do you know if your dad's contacted him since?
I have no idea.
And ma'am, I want to talk a little bit about your visit to LA in June of 2021. Could you tell us a little bit why you're there?
Sure, I was looking at UCLA's biology program, actually. My dad took me on a trip here.
When you visited UCLA, what'd you guys do?
We toured the campus. There was an admissions officer who gave us a bunch of information. We just looked around.
Did you get lunch that day?
We did. I had made a reservation at a pizza place, so me and my dad ate barbecue pizza for lunch.
Would you recognize a map of the area that you got lunch if I showed it to you?
I think so.
Could you turn to Exhibit 21 in that document. Your Honor, I'm directing the court and the witness's attention to that exhibit. Could you tell us what you're looking at?
Sure. This looks like a map of where my dad and I were walking right before we went to UCLA. It's got the restaurant on there and an ice cream shop we ate at later.
We offer Exhibit 21 into evidence. It's been stipulated to be fair and accurate.
Any objection to the admission of 21?
Pursuant to that stipulation, Your Honor, no objection.
21 is admitted.
Would you be able to use this map to show us where you and your dad went for lunch?
Yeah, I think so.
Your Honor, permission for the witness to step down, make use of a map for the jury to better see it.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor. I just asked that I be allowed to step down as well to see what the witness is doing.
Of course. You may step down if you're
Lauren,
comfortable with that.
You can come right down, and I'm going to give you a map, and I'm going to give you a pen, all right?
Okay.
Here you go. So I want you to use that pen to show the members of the jury exactly where you and your dad went on this map, okay?
Sure. Can you all see it? So the spoon and knife at the bottom is where we ate lunch. And then we walked, just down the block to the little ice cream shop. It's got an ice cream cone there.
I want to focus on that place right in the middle of those two shops. That suitcase icon. Can you tell us what that is?
Sure, it was the store right in between. I think it was a travel agency we passed that day.
Do you know what it was called?
Kline Travel, I think.
I want to focus on that because you and your dad, were you walking together?
Yeah, it was just 2 stores down.
When you walked past Kline Travel, did your dad stop and look at it?
No, neither of us did. We were pretty focused on the ice cream.
Did you guys look inside to see who was in there?
No, we walked right past.
Did your dad get angry at all while he walked past?
No, and my dad has kind of a temper. I definitely would have noticed if he did, but he was completely normal.
Thanks. You can sit back down. I'll take those 2 things from you. And Your Honor, permission to tender to the jury.
You may.
Now, Lauren, I want to talk a little bit more about what happened later on in the day and talk about your dad's mood generally, okay?
Sure.
When you went on your tour to UCLA, what was your dad's mood like?
Completely normal. We were both sort of watching the tour guide.
Did your dad stop and make any phone calls during that tour?
Not that I can remember.
How about earlier in the day when you passed Kline Travel? Did your dad stop and make any phone calls?
No, we walked right to the ice cream.
Was your dad visibly upset or angry while you were on your tour?
No, not at all.
Did your dad mention seeing your Uncle Barry at all during that day?
No, definitely not.
Now, Lauren, I want to talk about what happened later on in the day. Where'd you go after your tour?
Well, we had a couple of hours to kill before we were going to eat dinner, so we went back to the hotel we were staying at and killed some time.
Where'd you go after dinner?
After dinner, we went back to the hotel.
Did you stay at the hotel the whole time?
Yeah, my dad and I were sharing a room.
That night, when were you supposed to wake up?
We had a flight the next day at 5 a.m., but we went on the flight.
Did you stay asleep the whole night?
No, at around sort of 10:15, I snuck out of the hotel room and I went to a party with my friend Jackie. She's a sophomore at UCLA.
You said that you snuck out. What was your dad doing when you did that?
He was asleep.
Well, how about when you got back? Well, what was your dad doing then?
I mean, snoring, but still asleep.
In between the time that you were gone and when you came back, did your dad ever text you and say, hey, where are you?
No, and I definitely did not tell him that I had left.
Did your dad ever say, hey, I just woke up and you're not here, right?
That never happened.
Did your dad ever call or text you at all that night?
No.
Thank you, Lauren. I have nothing further.
Thank you, counsel. All right, you may proceed with cross whenever you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Shepard, you're here today testifying for your father, right?
I think that's how it works, yeah.
You love him.
Of course.
You do anything to protect him?
I mean, I don't know about anything, but I love my dad.
You would lie to protect him?
No,
Well, you've lied in connection to this case, haven't you?
not to protect my father.
But you have lied in connection to this case, yes?
I didn't tell my dad I went to the party, and I didn't tell the police that either. I didn't want to get in trouble. I wasn't supposed to be drinking.
Well, let's talk about that. You were interviewed by the U.S. Marshal, right?
Yeah, that happened last year in Philadelphia.
They asked you about your whereabouts for the night of June 25th, 2021, right?
Yes.
They asked you if you stayed in the hotel that night, right?
The UCLA guest house, yeah.
And you lied.
Well, I told him that I went to the party.
When they first asked you, you lied, yes?
I told him that I was there the whole night at first, but then I explained that I'd gone to a party and I was back at 3.
So again, bringing you back to my question, the first time the U.S. Marshal asked where you were, you lied.
Yes.
And then the U.S. Marshal showed you these text messages, right?
The ones I sent to Jackie, yeah.
And then you changed your story.
I'm sorry.
Well, you told the U.S. Marshal that you were gone from 11:30 a.m. or 11:30 p.m. to 12:30 a.m., right?
Yes, and then I explained I was actually gone until 3.
And we'll get to that in just a moment, but I want to be clear. You changed your story. You said that you were gone from 11:30 p.m. to 12:30 a.m., right?
Yes, like I said, that's what I said at first.
And again, that was a lie.
Right.
And then the U.S. Marshal showed you your Uber receipt, right?
Yes.
The Uber receipt said that you were gone until 3 a.m.
Objection, Your Honor, to hearsay. May I be heard?
No need response?
Yes, Your Honor. Actually, I can rephrase the question.
Okay. Objection sustained. The testimony is stricken. Ask another question.
Yes, Your Honor. Well, Ms. Shepard, you were gone until 3 a.m., right?
Yes, like I told the police.
Well, you didn't tell the police until after you lied twice.
I guess, but I told them everything.
Now I want to talk to you a little bit about your father. You would agree that your father is about a size 11 shoe?
I don't know what size shoe my dad has.
You don't know what size shoes he has. Well, you know how tall he is, right?
Yeah, I'd say 5'10", 5'11".
You say he's about 180 pounds.
But yeah.
Your Honor, at this time, my co-counsel is going to read onto the record Exhibit 3 from Bellamy Dembski.
Okay. Any objection?
There's no objection.
Okay, go ahead, counsel.
Line 40. The attacker was male, about 5'11", and 180 pounds.
Thank you. Now, Ms. Shepard, I want to talk to you about what you and your father did at UCLA. Or actually, in LA. Now, you did go on a college tour, right?
Yes.
But as you mentioned with Mr. Azari, that's not all you did.
While we were in LA, no.
You went to lunch.
Of course.
You went to the Pomodoro.
It was an Italian place.
And then you went to Saffron and Rhodes.
That's the ice cream shop I was talking about.
And between the Pomodoro and Saffron and Rose was a building, right?
Yeah, the travel agency.
And you actually showed the jury that it was Kline Travel Agency, right?
Right.
You walked right past it?
Yeah, me and my dad.
Right. Your father walked right past Kline Travel Agency.
Right.
Now, after you went to your tour of UCLA, you went back to your hotel, right?
Yes, before dinner.
You were there for about 3 hours.
Yes.
And during that time, your father asked you to put your earphones on, right?
Yeah, I was watching some TV on my laptop, so I put headphones in.
That's the only time that day he asked you to put earphones on.
Yeah.
And that entire time, all those 3 hours, he was on his phone.
I think so. I wasn't watching the whole time, but it looked like it.
Finally, I want to talk to you about Barry Capello. You know who that is,
Yeah, that's my uncle.
right? You've known him your entire life,
Up until about 4 years ago, yeah.
right? Your father was friends with him.
Yes.
He used to come to your home
Yes.
on your family vacation.
Yeah.
Like you said, you called him Uncle Barry.
And I miss him.
And like you mentioned, all of that stopped back in 2018.
Yeah, that was the last time that I saw him.
After 2018, your father called Uncle Barry a rat.
I don't think that was after 2018. I think it was the same year, but that is what my dad said.
Your dad also said, Uncle Barry is dead to me.
That's right, and I never saw him again.
I want to talk about why. You would agree that your Uncle Barry, he was involved in a trial back in 2018.
Yes, I saw it on the news.
In that trial, he testified against your cousin,
Yes,
against your family.
it was a mess.
He testified against your father.
No, he never testified against my dad. The trial was my cousin's.
But you're aware that he testified about your dad.
I think so. That's what my dad said.
At this time, my co-counsel will read onto the record a portion of Exhibit 5. That's an expert report on organized crime.
Line 33. Testifying against a fellow member is among the greatest sins.
Hold on
of
one
the-
second, I'm so sorry.
Oh, no.
You gotta give me a second to get there. Do you have any objection to reading from the exhibit?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. And this is prepared by who?
It's an FBI report, and it's been pre-admitted. It's one of those pre-admitted documents that we talked about during pre-trial.
Okay, understood. No objections. You may go ahead, counsel.
Yes, Your Honor. Line 33. Testifying against a fellow member is among the greatest sins a member can commit. It is punishable by death.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have no further questions.
All right. Thank you, counsel. Any redirect examination?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed when you're ready.
Lauren, opposing counsel just asked you some questions about the phone call that your dad made for about 3 hours, so I want to follow up with you on that, okay?
Okay.
You had your headphones. Did you have your headphones in when you were doing that?
Yes, I was watching TV, Bill Nye.
Do you know if your dad was on the phone the whole time that you were watching TV?
I wasn't watching him the entire time.
Do you know who he could have been on the phone with?
No, I have no idea. I didn't hear any of the call.
Thank you. Your Honor, at this time, I'm going to read Exhibit 4, a portion of that off the record, which is one of those documents that's been pre-admitted.
Okay, understood. Any objection to reading from Exhibit 4?
No objection, Your Honor.
Okay, you may proceed.
Obtain warrant for Audrey Shepard's phone, the phone. Checked call log from 0900 hours to 0400 hours on June 26th. Phone received one call from wife Carmela Shepard, beginning 9:03 on June 25th, lasting 3 minutes. Phone made one call to wife Carmela, beginning on 17:54, June 25th, lasting 4 minutes. With that, Your Honor, I have nothing further, barring a recross. May this witness be excused.
Okay, so, per our local rules here, this jurisdiction, recross is permitted.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, do you want to do a recross?
Before I do, can I
Okay.
ask for a time check?
You have 1 minute, 32 seconds left.
Your Honor, I'd like to recross.
Okay, you may proceed when you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Shepard, you just testified that your father wasn't on the phone the entire time, right?
Objection, Your Honor, under Rule 403, may be heard.
Yes, explain.
Your Honor, this is substantially more misleading than it is probative. The witness never said that her father was not on the phone for those 3 hours. I asked the witness whether or not she did know if he was on the phone for the 3 hours. She said she didn't know if he was on the phone for 3 hours because she was
Okay,
watching
understood. It's not a 403 issue. I'll let the witness get clarify if she chooses to do so. Overall,
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Shepard, you testified to the jury that you didn't know if your father was on the phone for the entire 3 hours, correct?
I wasn't watching him the whole time, but I think he was on the phone.
Well, Ms. Shepard, you just told the jury that you didn't know, is that right?
No, I just said that I wasn't watching him the whole time, but I think he was on the phone.
So to be correct, for that entire 3-hour period, your father was on the phone.
I think so.
No further questions.
all right.
Your Honor, in this jurisdiction, there is no redirect, so can we
Great.
have this witness be excused?
Yes, you are excused.
I can
Thank you
go.
for your time. You may.
Thank you.
With that, Your Honor, we rest our case in chief, and we're ready to move into closings.
Okay. You ready to move into closings as well?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay.
Before I proceed, permission to approach and retrieve Exhibit 25?
Yes, feel free to kind of take your time preparing and getting set up.
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
June 25th, 2021. The defendant is in LA with his daughter. He gets lunch, walks around, and there's something that catches his eye. Kline Travel. He looks in. He sees someone. Staring back at him is a ghost. It's someone that he used to work with. Someone that he used to consider family. Someone that you heard his daughter say was a rat. Someone that was dead to him. Barry Capello. For 12 hours, the defendant stood. He knew that he had his opportunity to exact the revenge that he waited 3 years for. And that night, June 25th, he got into his car, drove to Mr. Kline's home, grabbed the jumper cables from the car that he rented, wrapped them around Mr. Kline's neck, pulled him down to the ground, strangled him to death. Who wanted Tom Kline dead? Members of the jury today, we've proven that it was the defendant. And we had to prove that to you because when we came to court today, we brought a burden. We had to prove that the defendant, Augie Shepard, killed Tom Kline, intended to kill Tom Kline, and intended to kill Tom Kline because of testimony he gave back in 2018. Now, as the government, we had to prove that to you beyond a reasonable doubt. Members of the jury, I'm going to show you how we did it. Who wanted Tom Kline dead? Because members of the jury, you heard from U.S. Marshal Connor Wright that up until June 25th, 2021, no one wanted to kill Tom Kline. He was anonymous. No one threatened him. No one followed him. No one so much as recognized him until the defendant did. You heard testimony today that the defendant went with his daughter to lunch. Then they went to ice cream and they walked. You heard that between the lunch and the ice cream, well, that was where Mr. Tom Kline worked. And we know that the defendant saw Mr. Kline because you heard Mr. Kline's words. Augie Shepard just walked past my office. We made eye contact. And members of the jury, the defendant didn't need to stop and stare. He didn't need to walk in and confront him. Well, all he needed was time and opportunity. Did he have it? Absolutely. You heard today from Lauren Shepard that from 11:30 p.m. to 3 a.m., she wasn't with her father. She was miles away at a party. Only her father was there in the UCLA guest house. You also heard that there were no cameras. It was perfect. The defendant could get in and get out without being noticed. But what was the time window for the defendant? We know that Barry Capello was killed around 12 a.m. So did the defendant have the opportunity to kill him? Certainly. We know that it only took 20 minutes to get to Mr. Kline's house. That's enough time for the defendant to get there, murder him, watch him die, and leave without anyone knowing that he was gone. It's even enough time for him to go back to sleep like Ms. Shepard told you. We know that he had the motive and the opportunity. But did he have the means? We know exactly how Tom Kline was murdered, with these nightlight cables that were found next to his body. We also know that the defendant had access to nightlight cables because he rented a car while he was in LA. And the car company tells us that they had a pair of nightlight cables in every vehicle they rented. And that when the defendant returned the car, there weren't any cables. That's because the cables were sitting next to Mr. Kline's body right after the defendant killed him. The defendant was smart. He didn't leave any fingerprints on those nightlight cables, but he did leave footprints. You heard testimony today that at the scene of Mr. Kline's death, there were size 11 shoe prints on the ground. You heard from the U.S. Deputy Marshal that the defendant's shoe size was a size 11. You heard testimony that the defendant was 5'10", white male, black hair, 180 pounds. You heard from his own daughter that he was 5'10", 180 pounds. You heard testimony from Bellamy Dembski. Mr. Dembski, he wasn't here today in court, but he was across the street while Mr. Kline was getting murdered, and he saw all that happened. He told us that the attacker got into a dark-colored sports car and drove off right after he killed Mr. Kline. What kind of car was the defendant driving around him while he was in LA? Well, members of the jury, it was a dark-colored sports car. Who wanted Tom Kline dead? On June 24, 2021, that answer was no one. Tom Kline, well, he was anonymous. On June 25th, the number of people that know Mr. Kline's secret jumps from 3 to 4. And on June 26th, Tom Kline is dead. So what changed? The defendant came to town. The defendant saw Tom Kline. And the defendant killed Tom Kline. Testifying against the family, that's the ultimate sin. And it's punishable by death. The defendant delivered that punishment to Tom Kline. So make sure you deliver the punishment to the defendant. Find him guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. You can take some time if you need it to kind of set up and get ready and proceed with your closing whenever you're ready to go.
I'll take that time, I appreciate it. May it please the court. They didn't catch a killer. They closed a case. Members of the jury, bear with me, I'm going to try to get this right. The government wants you to believe that Augie Shepard, well, he got out of his hotel room in the middle of the night. His daughter's not there, he doesn't care. He walked out of his hotel room, got into the flashiest, most amazing car anybody could ever get, drove that car all the way across LA, parked it in the middle of the street, and he's at a house that he doesn't even know where it is, by the way. He parks that car in the middle of the street where just anybody can see the license plate, make, model, anything like that. He gets out of that car as soon as his victim magically appears outside of his house. He grabs him, strangles him, kills him, walks away, and nobody sees. That's the story that they want you to believe. It doesn't make any lick of sense. It's absurd because it isn't true. Members of the jury, they had the burden to prove to you, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Augie Shepard is the one who killed Barry Capello intentionally. He did so because he testified in the past. They haven't met their burden, haven't even come close, because they didn't catch a killer. They closed a case. So let's revisit those 3 questions that I told you we were going to talk about at the beginning of today's trial, starting with the first one. What evidence does the government actually have? Because we've been here for about an hour, members of the jury. You haven't heard about any DNA, fingerprints, eyewitness accounts, seeing Mr. Shepard leave his hotel room, coming back, driving across the street. Nothing. There's absolutely no forensic evidence. And sure, there's a footprint, size 11 shoe. My shoes are size 11. Everybody's shoes could be size 11. We have no idea who made that footprint. There were police walking around the scene. The neighbor walked across the street. If a single one of those people set foot in that grass, well, that could have been their footprint too. But look, members of the jury, I want to talk about this car for just a sec, and you're going to get a chance to look at this photo. This is the car they're saying my client drove to murder someone. If you see a car like this driving past you on the 405, you say, wow, that's a nice car. The U.S. Marshal said herself, it's not a car that you forget. But somehow, they're telling you that my client drove this car to kill somebody. Nobody saw it. Nobody remembers seeing this car. Nobody has any idea that this car drove 20 minutes from the UCLA guest house to that address that he didn't know. And that brings us to the second point. Could my client have even committed this crime? Because we heard cell phone data places that phone that Mr. Shepard owned in his hotel room the whole night. Now look, members of the jury, they called a witness to the stand. That witness, she was good at her job. You heard from Connor Wright. When she puts somebody in witness protection programs, nobody knows where they live. 100 witnesses in the past, not a single one has ever had their address leaked or they died. Nothing like that. But look, just let's play devil's advocate for a moment. Let's just assume that their witness is so bad at her job this one time that somebody figured out where he lived. Let's just assume that. How did he get there? Members of the jury, I don't know about you, but when I'm in a city that I've never been before, and I leave my hotel room to go find some place, you better believe I'm leaving with Google Maps. This person didn't have his phone. Didn't know how to get there. And even if he did, he didn't have a way there. So members of the jury, that brings us to the third question. Does the government's story make any sense? You found that it didn't. Because when you heard from Lauren Shepard, she told you exactly what kind of day they had. A normal one. She was out with her dad. They got lunch, got some ice cream, went to a college tour, went back to their hotel for a little bit, got dinner, went to sleep, and left. That was it. That was all he did on June 25th. That's what you heard. That's the story that makes sense. But the story that doesn't make sense is when the government tells you that Lauren Shepard, well, she left for about 4 hours in the middle of the night in a place that they've never been before. Her dad wakes up intending to kill somebody, and the first thing that he does is call his daughter? No. Text his daughter, hey, where are you? Because look, they can't have it both ways, members of the jury. They can't say this man is so obsessed with family, he's willing to kill somebody because his nephew went to prison, but at the same time tell you that he was not concerned about his daughter's well-being at all. That he woke up in the middle of the night, saw his daughter's bed was empty and said, whatever, time to go kill somebody. That doesn't make any sense. This is a man whose entire life is his family. This is a man who brought his daughter to LA to look at a college campus and leave. Their story doesn't make any sense. That's because they didn't catch a killer. They closed the case. Now, members of the jury, in just a moment, Miss Edwards is going to get back up. She's going to get another chance to speak to you. You may think she has the last word, but she doesn't. The judge doesn't. I don't either. You do. You're the people who decide whether or not the story that the government has presented to you makes any sense. You're the people who get to decide if they're right or if they're wrong. And I'll trust that you see exactly what happened in this case. That they didn't catch a killer. They closed a case. And I ask that you find Audrey Shepard not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. All right, would you like to deliver a rebuttal argument?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed whenever you're ready.
When the DeBruno crime family wants someone dead, they make that happen. The defendant had 12 hours to do it, and he did. You heard that the only time he asked his daughter to put in headphones was also the only time he was on the phone for 3 hours. And yes, members of the jury, we do believe that he got in a sports car and drove over to Mr. Capello's home. And sure, in Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Georgia, that's going to raise some eyebrows, but not in LA. Members of the jury, we were able to close the case today because the defendant caught a rat, Barry Capello, and he closed his casket. Find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. All right, so judges, we'll all wrap up our ballots. Once your ballots are submitted, just kind of give me a nod and we can move through some brief comments.